Imagine building everything from nothing, not with a safety net, not with a helping hand, just your mind, your hunger, and a stubbornness that refused to let the world win. Now imagine that the very people who were supposed to celebrate that, the ones who shared your blood, your childhood bedroom, your Sunday dinners, were the ones quietly, methodically dismantling everything you built. Not strangers, not enemies, family. That is the story of Naomi Clark. And before you assume you know where this is going, let me stop you right there. Because this is not a simple story about a woman who was done wrong. This is a story about what happens when a woman who has given everything, her money, her forgiveness, her future, her peace, finally reaches the moment where she has nothing left to give. And in that emptiness, she discovers something she never expected to find, herself, and something else. Someone who would see her, really see her, not for what she had, not for what she could provide, but for exactly who she was. But before we get to the light, we have to walk through the dark. And trust me, this dark is deep. Stay with me.
Hi, I'm Ray. Welcome to my channel, Tales of the Heart by Ray. I am glad to have you as part of my community. Please comment where you are watching from. I would like to know. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more beautiful and interesting stories.
Naomi Clark was 35 years old, and by every visible measure, she had made it. Her interior design and lifestyle brand, Clark & Co., had grown from a one-woman operation run out of her tiny apartment in Brooklyn into a full-scale business with a team of 12, a client roster that included some of the most sought-after residential and commercial spaces in New York City, and an annual revenue that would make most people her age dizzy if they saw the number. She had not inherited any of it. She had not married into it. She had not stumbled onto a viral moment or a lucky investment. She had built it, brick by brick, late night by late night, rejection by rejection, until it became something that could not be ignored. She drove a car she had earned. She lived in a brownstone in Harlem that she had purchased at 29. A decision everyone around her called reckless at the time, and a decision she never once regretted. She wore her success with the quiet elegance of a woman who understood that the most powerful thing about her was not what was in her bank account, but what was in her mind. She was sharp. She was discerning. She was the kind of woman who walked into a room and shifted the energy without trying. But if you looked closely, if you were the kind of person who paid attention to the small things, you would notice something underneath all of that, a tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep, a tension that lived in her shoulders even when she was laughing, a way she held her phone sometimes, staring at a message, her jaw tightening just slightly before she put a smile back on her face and carried on. Naomi Clark was exhausted, not from her business, from her family. She had a mother, Diane Clark, who had raised 3 children largely on her own after their father left when Naomi was 11. Naomi had watched her mother struggle through those years, and she had made a promise to herself, a silent, fierce, unbreakable promise, that when she made it, her family would never struggle again. She had kept that promise so thoroughly, so completely, that at some point the promise had swallowed her whole. She paid her mother's mortgage. She paid her mother's car note. She funded her mother's lifestyle, the salon appointments, the annual trips, the wardrobe, with the same consistency and dedication that she applied to her business. And she had done all of this not reluctantly, not resentfully, but with genuine love, because Naomi Clark, above all else, believed in family. She believed that blood was sacred. She believed that the people who came from where you came from deserved your loyalty, your protection, and your best. What she had not yet fully accepted was that not everyone felt the same way. Her mother, Diane, was a complicated woman. That was the most generous way Naomi knew how to describe her. On the surface, Diane Clark was charming. The kind of woman who could walk into any room and have everyone laughing within 5 minutes, who had a story for every occasion, and a wisdom that sounded profound until you examined it closely and realized it was always conveniently wisdom that excused whatever Diane wanted to do and justified whatever Diane felt. But beneath the charm was something harder, something sharp and unsatisfied. Diane had a way of making Naomi feel simultaneously responsible for everything and worthy of nothing. It had been going on for years, not dramatically, not in ways that were obvious enough to explain to someone else without feeling like you were overreacting. It was in the tone, the comments, the way Diane could wrap a wound inside a sentence so smoothly that Naomi would be halfway through her day before she realized she was bleeding. At 35, Naomi had still not brought home a husband, and her mother made sure that fact was never forgotten, not at family dinners, not at holiday gatherings, not even in phone calls that started as casual check-ins and somehow always ended with Naomi feeling smaller than when they began. "You know, your cousin Brianna just had her second baby," Diane would say, stirring her coffee, not even looking up. "Her husband built them a house in Georgia, a real house, 4 bedrooms. A pause. Then, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, "I just want that for you, baby. That's all. I just want someone to love you the way you deserve." The words sounded kind. They were not kind. They were a reminder, carefully packaged in concern, that Diane viewed her daughter's single status as a deficiency, a crack in the family image, a source of private embarrassment, a failure that Naomi's business success could not compensate for. And the worst part was that Diane said it so often, in so many different ways, that Naomi had begun, somewhere deep in the part of herself she rarely examined, to believe it. She had dated. Of course she had dated. She was beautiful, brilliant, and built. She had presence and warmth, and the kind of humor that made people want to be around her. But every relationship she had entered had eventually run up against the same wall: her family. The way her time was never fully her own. The way her money was never fully her own. The way her emotional bandwidth was perpetually consumed by managing other people's crises. Men who wanted a partner found themselves competing with a family that consumed her completely. And most of them, eventually, stopped competing. Naomi told herself it was fine. She told herself she was focused on her business. She told herself there was time. And then she would get another comment from her mother and quietly absorb it and carry it with her like a stone in her chest, one more added to a collection she had been building for years. Her brother Marcus was 31 years old and had the particular talent of making every disaster in his life look like someone else's fault. He was charming in the way that people who have never been held accountable tend to be, easy with a laugh, quick with an excuse, and extraordinarily gifted at making the person he had just wronged feel guilty for bringing it up. He had bounced between jobs with a consistency that almost required effort. He had started businesses with Naomi's money, naturally, that never quite launched. He had dreams, always dreams, that were large and vivid and perpetually just around the corner from becoming real. What he also had, though Naomi had not known the full extent of it for a long time, was a gambling problem. It had started as something casual, the way these things always start: a poker night here, a sports bet there. Nothing that looked like more than a young man blowing off steam and testing his luck. But luck, as it tends to do when it is leaned on too heavily, had turned on Marcus Clark somewhere along the way. And when it did, he had turned, as he always turned, to his sister. The first time he asked her for money because of gambling, he did not frame it that way. He told her he was behind on rent. She paid it without question. The second time, he said he had a car repair that had cleaned out his account. She paid that too. The third, fourth, and fifth time came with increasingly creative explanations. And Naomi, who loved her brother and wanted desperately to believe in the version of him that she held in her heart, paid every single time. She was not naive. She was not stupid. She was something more complicated than both of those things. She was hopeful. She was the kind of person who believed that people could be better if they were just loved well enough, supported consistently enough, given enough chances. Marcus had run out of chances to give by the time Naomi discovered the credit cards. She had been meeting with her accountant, a routine quarterly review, when the woman had asked about a credit line that appeared to be attached to Naomi's social security number. A card she had no memory of opening, then another, then a third. By the time the full picture assembled itself in front of her, Naomi was looking at over $40,000 in debt, opened in her name without her knowledge or consent. used to pay off gambling debts, casino markers, and private loans from men whose patience had apparently run out before Marcus's luck did. She remembered the drive home that evening. She remembered sitting in her car outside her brownstone for a long time, her hands in her lap, the engine off, staring at nothing. She was not crying. She was past crying. She was in that particular kind of silence that comes after a pain so sharp and so familiar that your body no longer knows how to respond to it with normal emotion. She confronted Marcus. He cried. He apologized. He told her she was the only person in the world he trusted, the only person who had ever really been there for him, and that he was going to get help, real help, and that he would pay every penny back. He was so convincing, so genuinely broken-looking in that moment, that Naomi had felt her own anger dissolve into something she could only describe as grief. Not grief for the money, but grief for the brother she had wanted him to be. And then her mother sat down across from her and said, very calmly, very simply, "He's your little brother, Naomi. Who else does he have? You have to take care of him. That's what family does." So Naomi cleaned it up. She paid the debt. She worked with her attorney to remove her name from the accounts. She did not file a report. She let it go. Not because she had forgiven it, not because she had healed from it, but because her mother's words had lodged themselves so deeply in her identity that she genuinely did not know how to choose herself over her family. It was not weakness. It was a kind of programming installed in childhood and reinforced daily that told her that a good daughter, a good sister, a good woman put family first, always, no matter what. She put them first every single time. Of all the things her family had done to her, what her sister did hurt the most. Not because it was the most damaging financially, not because it left the most visible mark, but because it came from the person whose love Naomi had assumed was unconditional, the one relationship in her family where she had believed she was truly safe. Jasmine Clark was 28 years old, and she was stunning in the way that people sometimes are when their looks have always been their most reliable currency. Effortlessly, and with a faint awareness of the power it gave her that she had never quite learned to use responsibly. She and Naomi had been close growing up in the way sisters close in age can be, sharing secrets, sharing clothes, sharing the particular intimacy of two people who had survived the same household, the same father's absence, the same mother's complicated love. But Jasmine had a pattern, a destructive, recurring, inexcusable pattern. Every man Naomi brought close, every man she introduced to her family, every man she mentioned with even a hint of warmth in her voice, Jasmine saw as an opportunity. Not out of malice, at least not the kind that was premeditated. Out of something more impulsive and more pathological. A compulsive need to be chosen, to be seen, to be wanted, that overrode every other consideration, including her loyalty to the sister who had paid her bills, defended her name, and given her nothing but love. It had happened 3 times that Naomi knew of. The first time, she had convinced herself it was a misunderstanding. The second time, she had been devastated, but had ultimately believed Jasmine's tears and her promises that it would never happen again. The third time, Naomi had sat with the knowledge for 3 weeks before she said a word to anyone, processing the specific quality of that pain. The kind that does not announce itself loudly, but settles into your bones quietly and changes the temperature of everything. She had forgiven Jasmine all 3 times. Not easily, not quickly, but she had forgiven her because the alternative, cutting off her sister, walking away from that relationship, accepting that the girl she had grown up with had become someone who did not love her the way she deserved to be loved, was a truth too large and too painful to fully hold. Her mother's response, when Naomi had finally broken down and told her what had happened the 3rd time, had been breathtaking in its consistency. "Sisters fight, Naomi. That's what we do. She loves you. She just makes mistakes. You have to let it go. Let it go." Those 3 words had been the operating instructions of Naomi's emotional life for as long as she could remember. Let it go. Move on. Keep the family together. Be the strong one. Be the one who holds it all in place. Be the one who forgives, absorbs, accommodates, and continues. Be the one who never asks to be held in return. She let it go. She always let it go. The one person in Naomi's life who consistently refused to let her lie to herself was her best friend, Simone Bridges. They had met in college, two women from similar backgrounds with entirely different personalities, who had somehow recognized in each other something rare and real. Where Naomi was composed and measured, Simone was electric and direct. Where Naomi processed everything internally for days before speaking on it, Simone had the particular gift, or curse, depending on the day, of saying exactly what she was thinking at the exact moment she was thinking it. Simone loved Naomi the way you love someone when you have chosen to love them, consciously, actively, with full knowledge of who they are and who they are not. She was the kind of best friend who showed up without being asked, who remembered the details of conversations from months ago, who could tell from a 3-word text message that something was wrong and would not stop calling until Naomi answered. She was also the person who had been saying, in increasingly urgent terms for the past 3 years, "Naomi, you need to cut your family off. I am not being dramatic. I am not exaggerating. What they are doing to you is not normal, and it is not going to stop until you make it stop." Naomi always had the same answer. "I can't do that, Simone. They're my family." And Simone, who was not the kind of woman who gave up easily, would always come back with the same response. "And you are also someone's family. You are your own family, and she deserves to be protected too." It was the kind of thing that Naomi heard but could not yet fully receive. She would nod and feel something stir in her chest, and then tuck it away somewhere. She'd decide not have to look at it and change the subject to something lighter, something easier, something that did not require her to examine the full weight of what she had been carrying. Simone let her change the subject, but she never stopped watching. She never stopped paying attention, and she never not once stopped showing up. That was the thing about Simone. She was the constant in Naomi's life that Naomi had always taken for granted, in the way that you take for granted the things that never leave, the things that are simply always there, like oxygen, like sunlight, so reliably present that you forget to call them gifts. It was a Tuesday in late October when everything began to change. Naomi had been attending the New York Business Growth Summit for the past 4 years, an annual gathering of entrepreneurs, investors, executives, and industry leaders that took place over 2 days at a hotel in Midtown Manhattan. She had gone the first year as an attendee hungry to learn. She had gone every year since as someone who had learned enough to also be worth learning from. Her presence at these events was comfortable now. She knew the rhythm, the networking rituals, the unspoken hierarchy of who stood where and spoke to whom. She had spent the morning in sessions about scaling operations, had done 2 breakfasts with potential collaborators, and had arrived at the mid-afternoon cocktail hour at the rooftop venue in the specific state. She often occupied at these events, professionally switched on, personally somewhere distant, a version of herself running smoothly on the surface while the real Naomi processed, somewhere underneath, the argument she'd had with her mother 2 days before, the suspicious transaction she'd noticed on one of her business accounts that morning, and the general low hum of exhaustion that had become her baseline. She had stepped away from the main crowd, glass of sparkling water in hand, to stand near the railing with a view of the city she had loved her entire life, letting herself breathe for a moment when someone came to stand beside her. "Everyone in there is performing," he said, without preamble, without introduction, without looking at her. He was looking at the skyline. "I mean that respectfully. But there's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from rooms like that." She looked at him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of bone structure that looked like it had been assembled with intention. Mixed heritage. She could see it in the warm olive tone of his skin, the dark eyes that held something that was not quite American in their expression, the jaw that was sharp but not aggressive. He was in a charcoal suit that was either very expensive or very well made, possibly both, and he wore it the way people wear clothes when they have stopped thinking about clothes. Naturally, without effort, as though it were simply the context his body occupied. But what stopped her was not how he looked. It was what he had just said, because it was exactly what she had been thinking. Performing what? She asked, turning back to the skyline. Confidence, he said. Certainty. The version of themselves that the room requires. And you're not doing that. He turned then and looked at her with a directness that was not aggressive but was entirely unguarded. I'm doing it in there. Out here, I'm taking a break. She laughed. It was unexpected, not a polite laugh, but a real one, the kind that arrives before you have time to manage it. Honest, she said. I find it saves time. His name, he told her when they finally got to introductions, was Daniel. Just Daniel. Not Daniel who works at, or Daniel from, or Daniel with the title attached. Just Daniel. He asked her about her business with the focused curiosity of someone who was genuinely interested and also genuinely knowledgeable. He pushed back, in the right places, asked follow-up questions that indicated he had actually listened to the previous answer. And when she talked about the challenges of scaling a creative business without losing the quality that had built it, he nodded slowly in the way people nod when something you've said has landed somewhere real in them. She found herself talking more openly than she normally did in professional settings. There was something about the combination of his directness and his apparent lack of agenda. He wasn't pitching her, wasn't networking at her, wasn't collecting her as a contact to follow up with. That made her lower the professional gloss just slightly. Not enough to be vulnerable, enough to be real. What she did not know, what Daniel had chosen not to tell her, with a deliberateness that she would not fully understand until later, was who he was. She did not know that the company she had been trying to secure a partnership with for the better part of 8 months, the company whose doors had remained politely but firmly closed to her every approach, was his. She did not know that Daniel Reeves was the CEO of Reeves Capital Group, one of the most influential private investment and brand development firms in the country, with a net worth that placed him consistently in the conversation of New York's wealthiest and most powerful men under 40. She did not know any of this because he had not told her. He had given her his middle name and nothing else. And for the first time in a very long time, he had met someone who liked him. Not the title, not the access, not what he could open. Just him, his thoughts, his observations, the particular way he saw the world. He had been careful with that before. He had learned to be. They exchanged numbers at the end of the summit, and he texted her that same evening. Not the next day, not in 3 days with a calculation designed to appear casual. That same evening, a message so straightforward it made her smile. Good conversation. I'd like to continue it. Coffee? She said yes. The coffee became 2 hours. The 2 hours became a standing Thursday evening. Coffee turning to dinner at a small restaurant in the West Village that they both somehow independently already loved. They talked about everything with the particular ease of two people who have found in each other a language that requires no translation. About business and ambition, yes. But also about fear, about the weight of responsibility, about the loneliness that can live inside a full life, about what family meant and what it cost. He was careful, she noticed, about the details of his life. He spoke about his work without ever naming it specifically. He referenced resources and access with a vagueness that she assumed was professional, caution or personal privacy, and she respected it without pressing. She did not Google him, something she would later reflect on with wonder, that she had simply decided to let him be whoever he was choosing to be with her, in the same way she wished people would let her be the woman in the restaurant, and not the business owner, not the provider, not the role. He was warm, unhurried, and consistently present in a way that men Naomi had dated before had struggled to be. He looked at her when she spoke. He remembered things. He called, not just texted. He had opinions and shared them without needing her to agree. He was comfortable enough in himself that he had no need to fill silence, no need to perform, no need to prove. She found herself, for the first time in years, genuinely looking forward to something that had nothing to do with work. She also found herself terrified, because the last time she had let herself feel this, it had not ended well. And because somewhere in the architecture of her heart, built and reinforced by years of being her family's emotional scaffolding, she was not entirely sure she believed that she deserved something this good. She mentioned him to Simone one evening, carefully, as though testing the weight of the words before committing to them. Simone put her fork down. "Who is he?" "A man I met at the summit. His name is Daniel." "What does he do?" "He's in business." A pause. "I don't actually know exactly what." Simone stared at her. "And you like him?" It was not a question. "I like who he is when we're together," Naomi said carefully. "I don't know enough about him yet to say more than that." Simone smiled. It was a slow, knowing, warm smile, the kind that said, "Finally, tell me everything." It had been 6 weeks since the summit when Daniel came to pick her up from her brownstone one Saturday evening after a dinner that had run later than either of them planned. The night was easy. They had been walking along the High Line, talking about nothing important and everything real, and he had insisted on driving her home even though she told him she was perfectly capable of taking a car service. "I know you are," he said. "I want to." She had let him. The drive uptown was accompanied by a playlist he had clearly curated with attention and the comfortable silence of two people who have stopped needing to fill space with noise. When they reached her building, she had invited him inside, briefly, casually, the way you do when you want to extend an evening without making it into an occasion. She wanted him to see the brownstone, the space she had created for herself that was perhaps the most accurate external reflection of who she was. He stepped inside and moved through it with the kind of quiet appreciation of someone who understood design. Pausing at the gallery wall of framed prints in the hallway, running a hand lightly over the back of the vintage reading chair by the window, looking up at the restored plaster ceiling details with recognition. "This is you," he said. Not a compliment, an observation, the way you observe a truth. "It's mine," she agreed. It was at this precise moment that the door from the back hallway opened and Diane Clark walked in. Naomi's mother was dressed for going out, or perhaps for being seen, which in Diane's world was the same thing. She had a key to the brownstone, because Naomi had given her one when Diane had made enough comments about not being welcome that Naomi had given in, as she always did. Diane stopped when she saw Daniel. Her eyes took him in with the particular efficiency of a woman who assessed men quickly and comprehensively. She smiled the social smile, wide and practiced, but her eyes were evaluating. "Well," Diane said, "I didn't know you were having company." "Mom, this is Daniel," Naomi said, and even as she said it, she felt the familiar tensing in her shoulders, the bracing, the internal preparation for whatever her mother was about to do. Daniel stepped forward with ease and extended his hand. "Miss Clark, it's a pleasure." Diane shook it, studying him. "Where are you from, Daniel? What do you do?" "Mom," Naomi said. "It's all right," Daniel said, still easy, still unbothered. "I'm from the city originally. I'm in investment and brand development." Diane nodded in the way that meant she was filing this information away for later use. She stayed for 20 minutes. She made 3 comments, all of them aimed, with that characteristic indirectness, at Naomi's domestic situation, at her age, at the brownstone that Diane called a lot of space for one person. She left with the lingering performance of a woman who wanted her departure to be felt. When the door closed, Daniel turned to Naomi. He looked at her for a moment, and she saw in his eyes that he was not performing. Does she always do that? Naomi opened her mouth to deflect, to minimize, to say she means well, or she's just like that, or any of the other scripts she kept ready. She stopped. She looked at him and said, quietly, "Yes." He nodded once, slowly, said nothing. But in the weeks that followed, she would notice that he was paying attention in a way she had not fully registered, that Daniel, who was deeply private about his own life, was very quietly and very carefully trying to understand the world that surrounded hers. Jasmine had recognized him within 48 hours. Naomi did not know this immediately. What she noticed first was a shift in her sister's behavior, a sudden increased interest in spending time at the brownstone, in being present when Naomi mentioned she and Fan plan, in finding reasons to call at unusual hours, with questions that were transparently designed to determine where Naomi was and whether Daniel might be nearby. Jasmine was subtle about it, in the way she was always subtle, which is to say, she was not subtle at all to anyone who was paying attention, but she relied on Naomi's loyalty and Naomi's hope to blind her. She showed up one Sunday afternoon when Daniel was at the brownstone, wearing an outfit calibrated with precision, and performed the warm younger sister routine with the ease of long practice. She laughed too readily at his observations. She touched his arm when she spoke. She asked him questions that were personal in a way that exceeded casual interest. Daniel was polite. He was warm in the distant, self-contained way of a man who has learned not to reward what is being offered. He did not engage beyond courtesy. But Naomi watched, from across the room, with the specific pain of someone who has been through this before. The sinking, nauseating recognition of a pattern you thought was behind you, manifesting again. After Jasmine left, Naomi stood in her kitchen for a long time. Daniel came to stand in the doorway. He looked at her, and she could see that he had understood what he had just witnessed, even without her saying a word. "Naomi, don't," she said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I just want you to know that." She looked at him, and something in her that had been braced for disappointment, braced so long and so consistently that the bracing had become invisible to her, shifted, just slightly, just enough. He had been trying to tell her for weeks. The conversation had started and been interrupted more times than he could count. By her phone, by his schedule, by the particular momentum of a relationship that was going so well that neither of them wanted to introduce anything that might complicate it. But the longer he waited, the more the weight of it sat with him. Because what he felt for this woman was not casual, and he was not willing to build something real on a foundation that had an absence at its center. They were at his apartment, an apartment she had visited several times but never examined too closely, accepting its scale and its location and its appointments with the same deliberate incuriosity with which she had accepted all the other details he had not volunteered. When he finally sat her down and said, "There's something I should have told you sooner," she looked at him steadily. Okay. He told her about Reeves Capital Group. He told her about what it meant, the scale of it, the reach of it, the way it had shaped every relationship he had tried to have for the past decade, the way people's behavior changed when they knew, the way women who had not given him a second look became suddenly fascinated, the way the money had made it almost impossible to know what was real. He told her why he had given her only his middle name that first evening at the summit. He told her that meeting her had been the first time in years that he had felt like a person rather than a portfolio. He watched her face as he spoke. She was very still. Her expression was unreadable in the way that Naomi's expressions were sometimes unreadable. That composure she wore like armor, under which, if you watched carefully enough, you could see things moving. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "The company I've been trying to get a meeting with for 8 months, she said slowly, "is yours?" "Yes. And you knew that." "Not at first. I looked you up after the summit. I found out then." Another silence. She looked down at her hands. He waited, giving her the space to process it, not reaching for her, not trying to manage what she was feeling. "Why didn't you tell me then?" she asked. "Because for the first time in a very long time, someone was interested in me and not in what I could do for them," he said simply. "I wasn't ready to give that up." She looked up at him. He held her gaze. "Are you angry?" he asked. She considered it honestly, the kind of honest consideration she rarely allowed herself. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I understand it. It was not the same as forgiving it, but it was where she was, and she gave it to him without dressing it up." He nodded. Fair. What was building in the background? What Daniel had sensed without being able to name it? What had made him, weeks earlier, ask his head of security and private investigation to look quietly into the people around Naomi, came to a head on a Friday evening in January. Marcus had been watching his sister's relationship develop with the particular attentiveness of a person who sees in every positive change in someone else's life a threat to their own access. The closer Naomi got to Daniel, the more she seemed to be pulling into herself, spending less time managing family crises, responding to her mother's calls with less immediate capitulation, finding what appeared to be a new gravity in herself that had not been there before. To Naomi, this felt like growth. To Marcus, it looked like a door closing. He had always known about the life insurance policy, Naomi had taken it out years ago as a responsible business owner and had, in a moment of uncomplicated family love, listed her mother and siblings among the beneficiaries. He had known about it and filed it away in the particular mental archive that people like Marcus keep, a catalog of resources, contingencies, and exits that are always there in the background, waiting for a moment of desperation to activate. The gambling debt this time was not $40,000. The people to whom he owed it were not credit card companies. He had made a quiet approach to two men he had met through a contact in the circles he moved in when no one in his family was looking, about a plan that turned Naomi's continued existence from a resource into an obstacle. The details were not spontaneous. They had been worked on, refined, tested against logistics with the methodical patience that Marcus had never managed to apply to anything legitimate in his life. What he did not know was that Daniel's investigator had been watching for weeks. The first call came to Daniel at 11 o'clock on a Friday night. He was with Naomi. He stepped out of the room to take it, and what he was told made the color leave his face in a way that Naomi, watching him from across the room, had never seen before. He came back in. He looked at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Not fear exactly, but a kind of fierce, controlled urgency. The look of a man who has just been handed something devastating and is already deciding what to do about it. "I need you to come with me," he said quietly. "What's wrong? I'll tell you everything, but I need you to come with me right now." She came. What he told her over the next 2 hours, with the investigator's report on the table between them, with the evidence laid out carefully and completely, piece by piece, was the kind of thing that breaks people. The kind of revelation that does not just hurt but reorganizes everything. Every memory, every moment of forgiveness, every time she had let it go, every time she had chosen her family over herself, into a new and terrible shape. Her brother had been planning to have her killed. She sat very still through most of it. She asked questions, precise, focused questions that the part of her brain that was always a businesswoman produced even in the middle of catastrophe. She looked at the evidence. She looked at the photographs. She looked at the documents. And then she sat for a long time in a silence that Daniel did not try to fill, that he simply bore with her, his hand on the table close to hers, not touching, just present. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "I need to call Simone." "Of course," he said. "And then I need to call my attorney. I have one you can use, or yours, whichever you prefer." She looked at him. There were no tears. She had moved past the place where tears were available and arrived somewhere colder, clearer, and utterly final. "This is really happening. Yes, my brother tried to have me killed. Yes." She looked down at the table. Something moved across her face, a wave of something enormous, and then it passed, and when she looked back up, she was still Naomi Clark, still composed, still present. But something had changed permanently, irrevocably, in the architecture of her. The last wall had come down. The last story she had told herself about her family, that they were difficult, that they were flawed, that they were people who loved her badly but loved her nonetheless, had collapsed. "Okay," she said. The next 72 hours were the most consequential of Naomi Clark's life. Marcus was arrested on a Thursday morning. The NYPD, briefed by Daniel's team, moved quickly and efficiently. The charges were serious: conspiracy, attempted murder for hire, identity theft from the previous credit card fraud, which he had never been reported for and which now formed part of a larger picture of a man who had been monetizing his sister's love for years. He had no good explanation. He had no story that held together. He had only the look on his face when the handcuffs closed, a look that Naomi was not there to see because she had made the decision not to be. She had made the call herself. She had spoken to the detective personally, given her formal statement, provided documentation from her attorney. She had done it with the same precision and composure she brought to a difficult business decision. Not coldly, not with vengeance, but with the particular clarity of a woman who has finally decided that protecting herself is not a betrayal of love, but the truest form of it. When her mother called, and Diane called within an hour of the arrest, Naomi let it ring. When Jasmine called, crying and frantic, she let it ring. When her mother called again and again, and then began leaving voicemails that started with grief and slid quickly into accusation. How could you do this to your own family, Naomi? How could you let them take your brother? You have destroyed this family. She listened to the first one all the way through, and then she deleted the rest without listening to them. Simone was at her kitchen table when she did this. She watched Naomi delete the voicemails. She said nothing. She simply reached across the table and put her hand over Naomi's. I'm okay, Naomi said. I know you are, Simone said. I also know that you don't have to be, right now, if you don't want to be. And for the first time in a very long time, perhaps the first time she could honestly remember, Naomi Clark put her head down on the kitchen table and let herself cry. Not the contained, managed crying she usually permitted herself in private. Real crying. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and old and long held. The kind that sounds less like sadness and more like release. Like the sound of something that has been carried too long finally being set down. Simone kept her hand on her back the whole time. She did not say it would be okay. She did not tell her to look on the bright side. She just stayed. As she had always stayed. As she had been staying, quietly and consistently and faithfully, for 15 years. In the weeks that followed, Naomi and Daniel navigated what any relationship would struggle to navigate. The exposure of his true identity layered on top of the catastrophe of her family, with a combination of honesty, patience, and the particular resilience that comes from two people who have both, in their different ways, spent years being wanted for the wrong things. She was never going to be someone who pretended the omission of his identity had not happened. She took it seriously, not as a betrayal, but as something that needed to be named and understood before it could be integrated. She asked him the hard questions. He answered them without deflecting. She told him that she needed to know, going forward, that the person she was building something with was also building with her. That there would be no more managed silences. No more strategic timing. I spent my entire adult life, she told him one evening, quietly, being the person who held everything together for everyone else while they held nothing for me. I don't have the capacity for a relationship that requires me to manage more than what's already there. I know, he said, and I'm not asking you to. Then say what you mean, she said, from now on, even when it's complicated, even when the timing isn't perfect. Yes, he said. And he meant it. What had already grown between them, quietly, steadily, built on the specific foundation of two people who had met without agenda and discovered something they had both privately stopped believing was possible, did not collapse under the weight of what they had been through. It held, more than held. It became, in the processing of hard things together, something with roots rather than just surface. He took her to meet his family, a warm, sprawling mixed household in Connecticut that felt nothing like what she expected from someone of his profile, that felt, in fact, the way she'd always imagined a family could feel if it was built on something healthier than her own. They received her with genuineness. They fed her too much. His mother called her the one he actually lights up around, as though this were simply factual, not complimentary. Naomi came home from that weekend and called Simone and said simply, I think this is real. And Simone said, I know, it's been real. The months that followed Marcus's arrest were legally complex and emotionally demanding, and Naomi moved through them with the same quality she brought to every hard thing, not without pain, but without self-pity. She worked with prosecutors. She worked with her attorney. She expanded Clark & Co. into a formal partnership with Reeves Capital Group, not as a favor, not as a gift, but as the legitimate business deal it had always been destined to be, built on the strength of what she had built and what the partnership could become. She did not speak to her mother or her sister. This was the part that people who heard her story, in the small circle of people she'd eventually trusted enough to tell it to, found hardest to accept. Because Diane and Jasmine had not been arrested. They had not been part of Marcus's plan, at least not knowingly. They had simply been themselves, and in the end, that was enough. Naomi had made the assessment, quietly and thoroughly, and without drama, that the people who had spent years dismantling her sense of worth who had conditioned her to believe she existed primarily to serve them, who had taken her forgiveness as permission to continue. Those people did not need to be criminals to be harmful. They simply needed to remain in her life for the harm to continue. She chose herself. For the first time in 35 years, she chose herself, not against her family, but for herself. She did not burn bridges in rage. She did not send letters or make speeches or pursue the kind of dramatic confrontation that her mother and sister seemed to believe she owed them. She simply withdrew. Quietly, finally, completely. She changed her locks. She updated the beneficiaries on her life insurance policy. She had her attorney send a formal letter informing her family that all contact was to cease. Her mother left messages that began in grief and escalated to accusation and eventually arrived at something that sounded almost like pleading. Jasmine sent emails, long, emotional, self-justifying emails that never quite arrived at a genuine apology but circled around it, orbiting it at the safe distance of someone who wanted the reconciliation without the accountability. Naomi read some of them. She did not respond to any of them. She was not angry anymore. That was the thing that surprised her most. She had expected the silence to feel like anger, but it felt instead like space, like the first full breath after years of shallow ones, like a room that had been too crowded for too long finally emptied of everything that did not belong there. Simone helped her plant a small garden on her brownstone's rear terrace. This was not something Naomi would have predicted about herself. She was not a gardener, had not been raised as one, had no particular connection to the practice. But Simone had suggested it one afternoon, casually, and Naomi had said yes because she was in a season of saying yes to things that had no agenda, and they had spent a Saturday afternoon with dirt on their hands and sun on their faces, planting things that would need tending but would, in return, grow. It seemed on reflection like the right metaphor. Daniel proposed to her on a Sunday morning, not at a restaurant, not with an audience, not with anything that suggested he had confused grandeur with meaning. They were in her kitchen, hers, the brownstone in Harlem, the space that was most accurately her, making breakfast on a slow morning, the kind of morning that had become, over the months, the favorite part of both their weeks. The light was the particular golden quality of early winter sun through old windows, and there was music she had chosen, playing from the small speaker on the counter, and he had been telling her something that made her laugh, and she had her back to him at the stove, still laughing when she turned around and he was there, not on one knee, just there, in front of her, holding a ring that was perfect and understated, and exactly what she would have chosen for herself, looking at her with an expression she had no word for except certain. "I have never known anyone who made me want to be more honest," he said, "more present, more worth knowing. I have never met anyone who made me feel like the version of myself I actually want to be. I don't want to do this life without you, Naomi, whatever it looks like, whatever it takes. I want it to be with you." She looked at him for a long moment. Behind her eyes, somewhere quiet and private, she thought of everything it had taken to get to this room, this morning, this man, the years of carrying, the years of forgiving, the brother who had tried to take her life, the mother who had tried to diminish it, the sister who had tried to steal from it, the best friend who had held her through all of it, the summit, the railing, the sparkling water and the skyline, and the man who had said, without introduction, that everyone in that room was performing. She thought about the woman she had been. She thought about the woman she was becoming. "Yes," she said. It was the simplest thing she had ever said. It was the truest thing she had ever said. He put the ring on her finger. She pulled him toward her. Outside the window, the city moved in its perpetual, indifferent, beautiful way. And inside the kitchen, in this brownstone in Harlem, Naomi Clark stood in a life that was finally, completely, unapologetically her own. The wedding was small, intentionally, deliberately, lovingly small. It was held in the spring, in the back garden of a house in the Hudson Valley that belonged to a friend of Daniel's. A property that looked like something from a dream, all stone walls and old trees and the particular smell of early April in the Northeast, damp earth and green things returning. There were 60 people. Every single one of them had been chosen with care. Simone was her maid of honor. She wore a dress the color of champagne and cried from the beginning of the ceremony to the end, which was unusual for a woman as self-composed as Simone, and which made Naomi love her more than she had words for. Daniel's family came in full, warm, loud, overflowing, and filled the small venue with the energy of people who knew how to celebrate without needing anything from the celebration beyond the joy of being present at it. There was no one from Naomi's family. Not Diane, not Jasmine. The absence was noted by some guests, not understood by most, and processed by Naomi in the weeks leading up to the wedding with the help of a therapist she had begun seeing in the aftermath of everything. A woman who had helped her name things she had never had language for, and to grieve things that deserved to be grieved, and to understand that the peace she felt about her decision was not coldness or damage but healing. She did not walk down the aisle with regret. She walked down the aisle with Simone at her side, through a garden she had helped choose, toward a man she had met at a summit on a Tuesday in October. And she was so completely, quietly, unperformatively happy that it made several guests cry for reasons they could not entirely articulate. After the ceremony, during the dinner, she sat for a moment alone at the edge of the garden, glass in hand, looking up at the stars that had appeared as the evening deepened. She thought about the girl she had been, the girl who had believed that family meant obligation, that love meant sacrifice, that her value was measured by how much she could give and how much she could absorb. She thought about the years she had spent being reduced, quietly and consistently, by the people she loved most. And then she thought about this garden, this evening, this ring, this life. She had not won it by giving until there was nothing left. She had won it by finally deciding that she was worth fighting for. Simone appeared beside her, 2 glasses of champagne in hand, and sat down without ceremony in the way that only someone who has been your best friend for 15 years can do. "How are you feeling?" Simone asked. Naomi turned and looked at her, this woman who had watched everything, stayed through everything, loved her without agenda through every version of herself she had been. "Like myself," Naomi said. Simone smiled. "Good," she said. "That's exactly what you should feel like." They sat together in the garden, under the stars, while the party went on around them. The night was warm. The music was good. Somewhere inside, her husband was laughing at something his mother had said. Naomi Clark had lost a family, and in the losing she had found everything she had ever actually needed. Her peace, her worth, her person, her people, and herself. The thing they never tell you about healing is that it does not announce itself. It does not arrive as a dramatic moment of certainty, a morning where you wake up and everything is resolved and the weight is simply gone. It arrives quietly, in small increments. In the moment you realize you went 3 days without thinking about something that used to consume you daily. In the moment you laugh, really laugh, and there is nothing underneath it. In the moment someone asks about your family and you answer truthfully and without apology and feel afterward, not sad, but simply free. Naomi Clark spent the year after her wedding expanding Clark & Co. into a national brand. She hired a team that she loved and invested in the way she had once invested in her family, generously, attentively, with genuine belief in what they could become. The Reeves Capital Partnership accelerated what would have taken her another decade to build alone, and she moved through that growth, not as someone who had been handed something, but as someone who had built the thing that made the partnership make sense. She saw her therapist every week for the first year, then bi-weekly, then as needed. She did not consider this a weakness. She considered it maintenance. The discipline she applied to her business, applied to herself. She called Simone every day, some days just to talk, some days just to sit on the phone in comfortable silence while they both worked in their respective spaces. Some days just to say, "I'm thinking about something," and have someone who would say, "Tell me." Her mother made 3 more attempts at contact in the first year. Her sister made more. None of them received a response, not out of anger, not out of cruelty, out of the same self-possession with which Naomi now made every decision, clearly from her own center, in service of the life she had chosen and was continuing to choose. Marcus was convicted. He received a sentence that the attorneys described as appropriate, and that Naomi received with no satisfaction and no celebration. Only a quiet, profound relief that the world had finally named what he had done. Daniel, for his part, was exactly who he had been that first evening at the summit: direct, present, consistent, honest. He was not perfect. He was better than perfect. He was real, which was everything. They had dinner with Simone and her partner every other Saturday. They traveled when the business allowed. They built things together, professionally, domestically, privately, with the particular care of two people who had both, by different roads, learned the cost of building on the wrong foundation. Some evenings, Naomi would sit in the reading chair by the window of the brownstone, the same one Daniel had touched the first evening, and she brought him inside, and look out at the street and feel something so complete it was almost incomprehensible. Not happiness exactly, something quieter and more durable than happiness, something that felt, in her body and her mind and the full length of her history, like arriving. She had been so many things to so many people for so long. Now she was simply herself, and it turned out that was more than enough. This is the story of Naomi Clark, the woman who gave everything, survived everything, and finally, beautifully, chose herself. If this story moved you, share it. Someone in your life might need to hear it today.